In this game that we're going to review, we're going to learn if this pawn structure is good for white, if it's bad. We're going to see how to play with it. We're going to see how to play against it. And of course, for that, we need to start from the beginning. Now, interestingly enough, this game starts with the Stonewall attack. I know that if you've been following this channel, you've seen me play the Stonewall attack a lot for the last few months. You know about the chess, of course, but this game is going to be focused more on strategy and positional chess. And of course, it's going to give us exposure to the typical plans and so on. So after knight to b4, let me actually flip the board. That way we look at it from white's perspective first, then we switch it to black's perspective and so on. So after bishop d3, or actually after knight to c6, we know that they want to play e5, they want to play knight to b4. We don't really care about knight b4. We're just as happy to have a pawn on d3, but we don't want to see pawn to e5, right? So instead, we go pawn to f4, knight to b4, knight f3, and then the black pieces at this point are very happy because they got our powerful bishop, but we really enjoy having a bishop on d3 because we can eventually push e4. It's keeping this knight away from coming on to e4, and it gives us the semi-open file, of course. Now, after bishop g4, we got queen to a4, which is a move I don't really like, but the white pieces felt like it was a good idea because they're getting ahead in the game, right? They're winning a few tempos, they're not pinned anymore. If the queen blocks, well, I'm going to take, and now this knight keeps moving around instead of developing other pieces, instead of castling. And then after knight to c3, we got bishop takes, pawn takes, and that's how we get to this pawn structure. Now, let's take a look at the evaluation of this position from black's perspective and then from white's perspective. Feel free to pause the video, try to do it on your own, and then compare to what we have here, right? Now, if I'm looking at this from black's perspective, I'm thinking, well, my opponent has a pretty bad pawn structure. There are 3 pawn islands, and here we go. The black pieces have no weakness, very healthy pawn structure, and it should be an easier game for black based on the pawn structure. The closer we get to the end game, the more of a liability these weak pawns become for the white pieces. Particularly this pawn that is isolated, this pawn on f4 and d4, double pawns, and the pawns in front are always the most vulnerable because they cannot be defended easily. Think of the rooks, like this rook could come over and defend this pawn, but it cannot really defend the pawn on f4. The same thing for this rook. It could go to d1 to defend d3, but it cannot defend d4. So these are things that make the black pieces very comfortable. Now, if we look at it from white's perspective, the white pieces might say, you know what, I understand all of that, but this pawn structure gives me semi-open file. I get another semi-open file to put pressure and attack. My isolated pawn on h2, I don't care. I'm going to advance it at some point, and I'm going to trade it off. And the most important thing for me is that white can always play e4 and put those pawns in motion. It is true that by playing e4, you're going to have d4 and f4 without support, but hey, you cannot have it all. Lastly, my king is in the center, but I'm not that concerned because there are no queens on the board. So I don't think the black pieces can coordinate an attack on my king. Worst case scenario, I stay in the center and I will be fine. Now in the game, we're going to see who's right, who's wrong. After g takes f3, the black pieces played c6, defending against my knight putting pressure on d5. And then after bishop d2, completing development, we have pawn to g6. Very simple, getting the bishop activated. Then king goes to f2, connecting the rooks. I don't think it makes sense to castle to either side. If I castle king side, well, I'm going to land on an open file. If I go to the queen side, the same thing. Instead, king to f2, and our rooks are connected already. Now, after bishop g7, I wanted to have you pause the video and think of how you continue. Not only the next move, but the overall plan. At the risk of getting you confused, we're going to talk a little bit about the minority attack. If you thought of h4, it is interesting. Keep in mind they could play h5. I know we always have these f5 ideas as well. Maybe it's a little bit too premature to play h4. Now, let's talk about the minority attack, and then let's see if we can apply it in this position. So the minority attack, you could see it in so many different, out of so many different openings, but let me give you one of the most famous examples. Let's say you're playing the Queen's Gambit and you get into something like this. Bear with me. And then we take, they take, bishop g5. So just trying to get to the key position, something like this. And then we got rook e8, right? So let's say something like this. Notice how we have on the queen side, we got 1, 2, 3 pawns. The black pieces have 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, more specifically, we got a2 versus 3 on this side. So we have less pawns. If we were in the end game with no pieces, the black pieces might think of, hey, let me use my pawn majority. I have more pawns as black to push them and create a pass pawn and hopefully get to the end and promote. But with pieces on the board, the middle game, a pass pawn is not going to make it far. So what we see the most is the person with the least amount of pawns putting them in motion to create weaknesses. For example, let's say I go rook to b1, knight f8, and then I go b4. All I'm trying to do is use my pawn minority to make contact and leave them with a weak pawn, right? So let's say they go a6, they don't want me to play b5 yet. Fine, I go a4, then let's say bishop e6, I finally make contact. After the trades, if they take on b5, well, you can see after you take that this is going to be isolated, I'm going to put pressure on it. d5 isolated, I'm going to put pressure on it. Let's say they don't take, let's say we have a move like this. Well, then you take them, and no matter what, you leave them with a backward pawn. All we're going to do now is put lots of pressure on that weakness that we created by putting our minority attack in motion. You could also see ideas with knight a4 in order to prepare some sort of a knight c5, occupying the square in front of the weak pawn, the backward pawn, right? So I know no need to go away from the main game, but now you see why the white pieces played pawn to b4. So I have a minority. It's not a this is not a Queen's Gambit game, but I can make contact just to undermine that pawn and then hopefully put pressure on it. Remember, one of the main assets for white is the semi-open files. Now, something that Reddy said in this game, Reddy's playing as the black pieces. Reddy said, well, yeah, they have two open lines or semi-open files, but if they want to take advantage of them, they need to focus on one, only one, double up rooks, and that might give black the possibility of occupying the other file. So it's an interesting idea. Now, after b4, we got pawn to f6, and this is when things start to get very interesting. The black pieces, Reddy, of course, being a great player, he understood he needed to strike that center. He needed to play e5 to break that apart and, of course, activate the bishop as well. And this goes back to another principle. If you're being attacked on a flank, b4, b5, the queen side of the board, well, you should strike the center. So that's why you see f6 to undermine that stone wall, if you think about it. Now, after f6, the white pieces played pawn to h4. That's the other plan. I have an isolated pawn. I want to put it in motion to get rid of it, to open up lines, to attack, and so on. Now, it was very interesting, honestly, to execute after f6 to execute pawn to e4. This is a typical plan. If you saw me go play my games in the playlist where I brought the account from 600 to 2200 plus using the Stonewall, you saw this e4 a lot. In the chessable course, you see this plan in many different lines as well. They did not play it, but if they had played it, it could continue something like this. I fix my pawn structure. These doubled pawns are not doubled anymore. If they play 5, I fix my other doubled pawn, and then finally I go pawn to d5. and we get a very nice position for the white pieces. In the game, the white pieces continued with h4, then finally e5, knight to e2, and then after king f7, we have pawn to h5. So far, I don't know about you, but I really like this position for white. I'm not saying black is in trouble, I just prefer to play this as white. But then after e takes d4, the white pieces made a silly mistake. They went, and I'm not even going to ask you how did you capture, because I hope you're not thinking of e takes d4. This is what they played in the game, and needless to say, it's very, very ugly. Doubled isolated pawns over here, and you don't really get compensation for it. Instead, knight takes d4 made more sense. At least it makes more sense to me. Now, you could continue as black by opening up the bishop. You could go pawn to f5, but then you simply go bishop c3, improving your bishop, controlling that diagonal. If they take on d4, you take with the bishop. So something like this would have been a very nice position for white. I'm not saying we're winning, but now black has an isolated pawn. Soon I'm going to get rid of my isolated pawn, and I definitely don't get the ugly pawn structure that they got, right? Now, going back here, in the game they played e takes e4, and this has to be already very bad for white. I wanted to show you up to this point how the white pieces play the game from white's perspective, because I really like the way they handled it. And then from here, I'm going to jump to the other to the other team. I want you to see it from this moment on from black's perspective. Not because I want you to see it from the winner's perspective, but for you to see how, after such a mistake, how the black pieces took advantage of it. So what's the plan? How do I put pressure? How do I capitalize on my opponent's horrible position? Because I'll tell you something, I've been here myself where the black pieces are. I know that I'm better pawn structure, but then I end up blowing it, or the game is simply a draw. So what would you play next? What's your plan? Well, in the game, of course, f5 was played, opening up the bishop. All we're going to do is maximize your pieces and then put pressure on weaknesses. We need to find targets to put pressure on. And that's why this is so bad for white, because they're giving us very easy targets to put pressure on. Don't forget, the ones we should focus on are the ones in front, because these back here are easier to defend for them. So f5, opening up the bishop, then rook to c1. They're trying to play b5, and if we take, they penetrate to the 7th rank. So how do we deal with that? Well, pawn to a6, then rook to h2, trying to put pressure down the g file. That's going to be our weak pawn. When they take, we take back with the pawn. They want to put pressure on it. Not a big deal. The black pieces are saying, fine, you're going to use the h or the g file. I'm going to use the e file to put pressure. So pawn takes, rook g2. This file doesn't really do anything for them. So their best chat is to put pressure on g6. Now, time for us to double our rooks. I could go to e7 and then rook e8, but even better, a multi-purpose move. We could go rook e6, defense, and then gets ready for doubling up. So rook e6, rook e8, and then had to go back. They could have played something like rook f1 and they defend, but now notice how that king is keeping the white rook from coming over to the queen side. How is this important? Well, the next step for black is to ask themselves, which of my pieces can I improve? Whenever I'm in a situation like this, that I know I'm doing things the right way, I have a good position, but I don't know what to do next, I ask myself, which of my pieces can I improve? In this case, my knight. Where should the knight go? Well, with all of my opponent's pieces, if you split the board in half, you can see most of the white pieces are on the king side. So I'm going to go knight to b6, knight to a4, b2, and put pressure on d3. And it's going to be very uncomfortable for the white pieces. Of course, after rook e8, we have rook e1 instead of king f1. Then knight to b6 anyways, we got to put pressure. That knight was doing nothing for us. And then we got king to f1. Once the rook is ready to go to the queen side to defend if necessary. Now, what would you have played if the white pieces went, let's say, bishop to c1? because basically with the idea of preventing you from going to b2, right? What should we play as the black pieces? Well, I hope you found it. If you haven't found it, feel free to pause the video until you find a nice move here for black. Well, we got bishop d4, give me the free pawn with check because the knight is pinned to the rook, right? So instead we got king f1. Also, if they have played bishop c3, then they're giving up on this square. So I'll penetrate and I'm putting pressure on d3 already. Again, it's all about finding those targets, weaknesses, put pressure, and then eventually they're gonna collapse. I don't think they can defend that well. Knight a4 is still in the air, so very nice position for black. Instead, again, in the game they went king f1, knight a4 anyways, rook b1. It feels very good when you're playing your games and your opponents are defending. So rook h8, I don't have anything else over here, so I'm going to find a new route, a new file. From here, I'm planning to activate the bishop. So I'm going to go bishop f6, rook h3, bishop h4 if necessary to kick the king away from defending this pawn. So in the game, we got king f2, bishop f6, we know what this is about. And then after rook h3, I'm ready to collect that pawn. Not much they could do. Bishop h4 is in the air, so the white pieces decided to just go rook to b3 to defend d3. So finally the first pawn falls. The rook, very ugly, just defending. Then we got rook f2 and another critical moment. Should we trade rooks or not? I always tell you that if I'm up a pawn, just one pawn, I'm happy to simplify the game and go into an endgame where that extra pawn should win the game. However, here we have a very active rook versus a passive rook. So I would rather keep my rook on the board. If they go rook h2, for example, we take it, and then the knight is going to fall on e2. So instead, after rook h3, we see king to g2, then rook goes back to safety. This is a move that I really like, probably one of my favorite moves in the game, because you don't know how many times I've been here, I'm winning, I know it, and then I get fancy. I do something like bishop h4. If you take me, I take you, but then this just gets weird. Like let's say they go rook f1, my king is in trouble, my rook is in trouble. It's just not necessary. So the fact that the black pieces said, you know what, I'm going to go back to h7. If I evaluate this position, I have to be better. Better pawn structure, I'm up a pawn, better piece coordination. So let me keep this position rather than complicate it. So after rook b1, we got rook e8 trying to double up, then king f3, big mistake. And after this check, well, we collect on d3 and the other pawn fell. Both doubled pawns eventually fell, we're hitting the bishop, and at this point, the white pieces simply resigned. So you can see how you could be playing a great game strategically, and then one silly mistake, such as e takes d4, it ruins your game forever. You just don't have a plan. Now, I know you might be thinking, well, but they resigned there, but my opponents would never resign at this point. Well, I encourage you to take this position. I'm going to leave the PGN in the description. Copy it, paste it, and see if you can finish this against the engine. It doesn't have to be the most difficult engine. You could find one of the bots that you typically play against and see if you can convert. That's a great exercise. So with that said, I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I'll talk to you in the comments.